Welcome wherever you are, whatever time you're listening, to this episode 2 of the EdTech Toolbox with Andrew Mowat as a part of the Ignite EdTech team. This is, as I mentioned, episode 2, and today we're getting our sleeves rolled up, diving deep into two platforms that are very similar that help you engage in small data in the classroom. This can be live, it can be remote, it can be for K-12 or tertiary education, and it can be for adult training. So these two programs, or platforms as I prefer to call them, are very powerful in the way that they can engage and help analyze, in other words, deepen the work that your participants, be they students or adults, deepen the work that they do in the moment of learning. Before we do that, I'd like to introduce you to, or rather remind you, if you've heard of some of my work before, of two models. These two models will frame and differentiate the work we're doing in this podcast and bring deeper understanding as to why a particular app or platform or technology has value in learning and teaching. These two models interact very elegantly in this space and help us understand to a much deeper level why a particular technology might be useful in helping our learners learn better. Before we get into these two models and then into the technology we're going to review today, I want to remind you that you might be listening to this on a podcast as audio, you might be watching on YouTube, or you might in fact be watching on Ignite EdTech's learning platform, learning.igniteedtech.com. Now, of all of those forms, my preferred favorite, of course, is the learning platform, because here you'll get access to all the other resources as separate assets, separate items in a course-like structure. So I'm trying to hybridize the idea of an online course with the concept of a podcast to bring you deeper value. So a reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube or listening in some sort of audio platform, please head on over to learning.igniteedtech.com if you're interested in seeing all the value adds of this program. So while we're on housekeeping, it's important to mention the sister podcast, in so many ways the older sister podcast of this one, from Craig Kemp, the founder of Ignite EdTech. And his podcast, the EdTech podcast, is a really useful and engaging podcast series that each week connects you to so many aspects and people in the EdTech landscape. This week, besides useful tips, tricks and apps, he connects with and interviews Trevor McKenzie, who is well known for his inquiry mindset work. So check out the EdTech podcast by Craig. You'll see it in similar places to this one. So if you're not already, check out Craig's podcast on the same platforms that you'll find this one, and we'll also be hosting some of his sessions inside learning.igniteedtech.com as well. And one final thing before we get into the substance and the discussion of today's podcast, and that's a shameless plug for a range of programs now on learning.igniteedtech.com. Courses now available include an introduction to EdTech, a free course for those who really just want to get the basics and orientation around the landscape of EdTech, EdTech Foundations for new teachers and even established teachers who need to really get onto the EdTech bandwagon. And we have, of course, the program for support staff often being the forgotten people in our schools. And this program helps your support staff level up their IT support by being more intimately engaged with the core business of educational technology in your school. We have other programs sitting there and soon to be released, so keep an eye on these and feel free to share them with your school or your colleagues if you feel that they have value. And now to the models that we'll use to support our analysis of the technology each week. Each of these is powerful in their own right, and the first that I want to cover is the Aegis model by David Rock. Now, this has been around for some time now, I think since about 2011 or so, and it describes 4 elements that are necessary to be present for learning and deep engagement. And these 4 elements are attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. So in the learning design and delivery, these need to be present for deep learning to occur, both in adults and children. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, for soon I'll be posting these as separate standalone explanatory videos in this learning portal, the sort of hybrid course that it is, if that makes sense. That's one of the values of actually engaging with this podcast series in the learning platform. So if you're hearing this on a podcast, then occasionally I'll be referring to visuals, and those visuals will be available on Ignite EdTech's learning platform. So behind me I have an illustration of that model, as you can see if you're watching, and that helps you understand the elements of that model. So the Aegis model really helps frame the value, the learning value in a particular technology. And of course what we want to do is to make sure that the technology provides in and of itself elements of attention generation or work, emotion and spacing over time. The second of these two models is from Ruben Puentedura, and this is a stock standard gold level model from the world of EdTech, and those who've been involved in EdTech for some time would know of Ruben's model. SAMR stands for substitution, augmentation, modification and redefinition, and this describes the depth to which the technology is bringing new experience to the student or the participant. Again, I'm not going to explain this to any great depth here, and if you are new to this model, please check out the accompanying videos on the learning platform as described before. These two models will combine really powerfully to describe the value, the net value and the net opportunity that technology can bring. And this week, of course, we're considering small data apps. And so now to the apps in focus for this week. And as mentioned, the theme and the frame to these two apps is the idea of small data in the classroom. Now, by small data, I mean the collection, analysis and engagement with data that's collected by a small group about themselves or about a topic or focus in the curriculum. As a trainer, I use these two platforms all of the time to engage my participants in discovery about aspects of their own team, for instance, or about the environment in which they work, or the context or content that's important to them in their moment of learning. So the first of these is Mentimeter. And I mentioned Craig Kemp before. I still remember the session where Craig introduced me to Mentimeter, and I was very excited with its potential for engaging participants in learning. And so we'll look more deeply into Mentimeter, and it hasn't really had much of a competitor until recently. And this platform is Ahaslides. And so these two platforms are very, very similar, to the point where you think, if you're a Mentimeter user, that Ahaslides might be a bit of a copy. I don't say that it is. I don't want to get myself into any legal trouble, but certainly the two ways that you engage, but certainly the two platforms look and feel and work essentially the same. Now, there are other apps that are worth considering in this space that I'll mention at the end, but for the purposes of this analysis, we'll look at just these two. There's a third that I do want to mention, which is a really exciting opportunity. It's restricted to Windows and PowerPoint, but does many of the things that I'm going to show you here as well. So let's dive in, roll up the sleeves, and have a look at these two platforms, and later we'll start to look at the learning value in these two opportunities. So a quick look at one of the slides, the presentation slides of Mentimeter, and this is a word cloud from Mentimeter. Now, many apps will do word clouds for you. The value in this is that these two platforms deliver live results as your students are entering them. And so there's some visual beauty and engagement in the way that these words pop for students in your class as they're entering these terms and these data. Now you can see here, this is a slide that has 12 participants, and this is a part of a program that I ran a few years ago around metacognition, and I simply asked the group, what are the things that are most important of 10 that I gave them that are important to you for further investigation and learning? of the 10 dimensions, what 3 would you like to improve, as you can see. And this then provides not only an engaging presentation of their content, but an interesting cascade point for the deeper analysis of the work that goes on. So for me as a presenter, I could quite clearly see by the size of the term that's shown on the screen how important it was to the group relatively. And so questioning is one of those elements that's really powerful. You might think that this is a little bit on the light side, and depending on, I think, the ownership of the data and the relevance of the data, this can be a little bit on the light side. But a story from a recent webinar that I delivered to a leadership group really starts to show the value of this. The frame for the workshop was to look at difficult adult behaviours and how to handle them. And the question we posed was, what behaviours do you struggle with in your organisation? So then we got a word cloud list of all of the behaviours that this group themselves struggled with in their own team and their own organisation. Now this is quite strong and emotive information, and I was surprised by the depth and the breadth of the discussion that followed. We were able to dig into and look at not only the terms that were there, but what some of those terms might mean to different people. I remember one of the biggest words that popped up, as you see questioning here, was taking responsibility. And there was quite some deep discussion and learning value that was triggered by, first of all, collecting this information, and then secondly, presenting it, and then thirdly, analysing it. So where there is ownership and connection and even emotion in the data, then something as light as a word cloud has tremendous value. What I'll try to remember to do is to describe the visuals so that people who are listening to this rather than watching this can understand what we're seeing. And most people understand what a word cloud is. What I do want you to do is to think of both the SAMR and the Aegis model. The SAMR model talks about whether the technology enhances an activity or whether it transforms it. Now, in the previous example, you might describe that as being somewhat enhancing, moving into transforming. It was the presentation of the information that was the trigger, so therefore I could have collated that information myself and presented that in a similar sort of way and taken a lot more time. So working through my own logic there, we're in the enhancement part of SAMR, probably augmentation, rather than into modification or redesign that sits up in the transformation. In saying that, we don't necessarily need the judgment that substitution is bad and redefinition is the aspiration. In the delivery of a good learning design, it may well be that you cover each of those or some of those or one or two of those elements in the SAMR model. You just need to match the level of engagement of the technology with your learning design. So it's entirely appropriate. You might at some stages just involve yourself in substitution. But what this does tell us when we look at the Aegis model is that the technology and the methodology has allowed us to hold attention better. It's allowed way more work to be done by the participants, so generation is much higher. We've had the opportunity to trigger a great deal more emotion, and spacing really isn't appropriate at this point in time, as you'll see if you look at the model and its video. So while we may have only got to the enhancement stage in the SAMR model, we have certainly deepened the engagement with much stronger examples of attention, generation, and emotion. So with that in mind, let's have a close look at some of the other slide variations. And again, in talking about this, I'm giving more demonstration of Mentimeter simply because I've been using it longer and I've got more real data that I've used over time. The two operate similarly, but not identically. So hold that in mind and we'll look at the comparison a little bit later on. So here behind me, I've got a sense of just collecting single points of data against 7 places. In this case, it's what are the barriers to giving feedback, and there were 7 choices, and people chose 1 to 3 variations and collected dots in various containers, if you like. And by looking at this, you can see very quickly where most people placed themselves and where least people placed themselves. So it gives insight maybe into the data that belongs to a group. In terms of attention and work done, or the attention and generation dimensions of Aegis, what we want is attention, reflection, clarity, and insight. They're the 4 steps that we're really going through in the metacognitive sense. If we can get insight, then fabulous, but we definitely want reflection and clarity to emerge from that reflection. And that's what good analysis does. So again, you can see how this sort of technology can build on the attention and generation dimensions of the Aegis model. Perhaps into some of the more expansive uses of this. I really like the technology's ability to quickly show the underlying data. Now, this definitely does move up from the previous 2 examples from enhancement into transformation. And I think we've probably strongly moved into modification, maybe even redefinition in this particular space. This data set is all about using a model, and you can see this nice 2x2 grid that's possible with the data set here. So I've been asking people to rate themselves horizontally on a particular scale from cool to warm in terms of their ability to deliver feedback, and vertically in terms of diluted or not strong through to strong. And this is related to a model I use often in feedback called the warm-strong model. And so this first one was, where would you like to be? And while this is a fairly small group, you can see that the data set, by clicking and holding on the number 2, the pink 2 there, we're able to expand the data set to show the real data points that people entered. Aspirationally, people are very much in the strong and warm top right-hand quadrant of the right-hand quadrant, if that makes sense. But when you take a look at the previous version of this, or the antecedent version, I asked people also, where are they now? And so for those that are listening, if you can imagine a 2x2 grid with data points that are basically centered in the top right-hand quadrant, but spread also in the bottom right and the top left. So the spread of the data, when we click on the center average point, it spreads out and shows all of the data points that are present. And this gives sometimes some surprise and insight. Now, surprise is an important emotion that is a part of the Aegis model. When we create surprise, it's a form of insight. It provides more neuromodulator action on the synapses that are present and marks them for being strengthened, which is the underlying process of neuroplasticity and metacognition. Another example of this is a pre and post test. For me, in my workshops, I like to get a sense of where people are to begin with on 2 dimensions and where they might be at the end of the learning intervention, the end of the workshop. And so again, for those that are listening, we've got 2 horizontal scales this time, not a 2x2 grid with a 90-degree opposition of 2 dimensions. This time we've just got 2 horizontal scales. So the first of these is about knowledge. Where are you in terms of knowledge about listening, questioning, and conversations? And where are you in terms of your confidence? So we've got a blue data set and we've got a pink data set again. And we've got a nice slider with an average 5.9. And without having to click on the data set, behind it's a bit like a hill. And what the hill is showing is a distribution of the responses from the group. And I can see from that particular data set that there are 2 peaks, probably about 5 and probably about 7. So I've got a group in the cohort that are not that strong on knowledge, and I've got in the confidence a much greater separation of 2 groups, one that's about 5 and one that also looks about 7, and they're entirely grouped into those 2 divisions. So that gives me strong insight in terms of the prior knowledge and confidence that a group might be bringing to a workshop or a class. If we now look at the post-test, I can see the work that I've done in that session and the value that it's brought. So we've not only moved the average from 5.9 to 7.4, but we've aggregated the data set that sits behind that. So we've got much more cohesive data that sits behind that. So I know I've helped aggregate the class's knowledge to a much stronger point. Similarly with the confidence rating, and it's usually not as strong as the knowledge base, and that's fairly regular, but I can see both a move to the right and an aggregation of, instead of 2 key data peaks, I've now got a single data peak. So for me, in my teaching practice, less for the learning side of the game, but now much more for the teacher, I've got some strong insight into not only where people were when they came in, but the value add in the session and how they walked out. So to summarize then, these platforms, Mentimeter and Ahaslides, give you wonderful engagement through visuals, deeper clarity through the presentation of data, and richer learning through making more meaning of the data that's presented. Each of these platforms offer similarly different slide types and templates through which you can poll in different ways, from multiple choice to sliders to word clouds, and even just straight text input with bubbles and other such presentation techniques. So before we get into use cases and a comparison of the two platforms, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the workflow in which you might use these applications. Clearly, learning design comes first. What's the purpose you're trying to achieve? What transformation are you looking for? What problem are you solving? Is this about remote engagement? Is this about asynchronous collection of data? Is it about holding people's attention and deepening their understanding and meaning of the data that they create? So being clear on your learning goals for the session that you want to use this in, being clear of those learning goals is key. Then the design phase literally allows you to construct slides and create poll types that match your learning needs. So the second phase of the workflow is all around data collection, and both apps make this relatively easy for you. Both provide a variety of means through which you can distribute your slide set with included polls to your user group. These include URLs, codes, and even QR codes. And these make it very easy to engage an audience, whether it's face-to-face in real time, or whether it's asynchronous in a course, or whether it's on a Zoom call or some sort of remote learning session. So distribution becomes a part of your design and workflow. And then we've got the presentation of the results. Again, that can be synchronous or asynchronous. I prefer to work synchronously with the results with an audience, because then you can use collaboration, breakout rooms, working in small teams in real life to deepen reflection, clarity, and insight from the data. And the more we can generate and create surprise as an emotion with a data set, the deeper the learning will be. So some of the use cases for Ahaslides and Mentimeter. Anything where you need to get input from a user as a part of your learning design will fit the domain of these two applications. So, as you've seen, examples could include word clouds, entry and exit polls, knowledge testing with multiple choice answers, icebreaker games with remote teams or remote classes, different sorts of data collection in synchronous or asynchronous settings. The list is huge. One deeper example that I would like to use, first shown to me by Alan November at a conference, an EdTech conference a number of years ago, and using a different platform but easily adapted to these two platforms, was the idea of presenting some science information, testing a concept, but going much deeper than our usual shallow pick the correct answer in a multiple choice type question. And here's how the learning design worked. First of all, Alan provided us with some basic but not complete information with a question. He showed us a picture of a log made of wood, obviously, and the question was, where does the mass of the wood come from? Work in groups, put your answers into the following live polling application. And he could see immediately there was a very strong bias in this adult group of people towards the wrong answer. And he'd only given part of the information. And this was a non-science crowd, quite clearly. He then said, what if I told you that the only two inputs into photosynthesis were carbon dioxide and water in terms of materials? Of course, we've got sunlight as an input as well. What would that do to your thinking, and how might it change your answer, if at all? Work in your groups and submit your second question. And so the value in the group was, first of all, to see the way everyone else was answering the question and see that we might have the answer correct here because we're in the majority, but hey, hang on, we're not. The input of some extra information and the chance to go back to groups, decide on an answer, and then input that answer into the interactivity of the session. And lo and behold, the majority of people got the question right. Now, I still remember that as a small learning piece, both for its impact in the session, but secondly, for the way that he used an approach of discovery and surprise using technology to summarize the data as a way of deepening the learning. So any application that presents data in a live format like this would work, and this example works particularly well in both Mentimeter and in Ahaslides. I'm really interested at the moment to find out what's coming up for you. So if you're watching this as a part of YouTube, or in fact on the learning platform for Ignite EdTech, there are places where you can add your comments. If you're listening to this, I really encourage you to get involved in the community discussion, because it's the discussion that deepens learning as well. Why? Because of the generation in Aegis. We're holding our attention for a bit longer. Maybe there's a bit of argy-bargy, a bit of argument going on, and that raises emotion. And of course, just the work of engaging with other people through that process, the generation deepens your learning. So social learning itself is critical for development through the Aegis model. So hopefully so far you can get a sense of the flavour of this particular podcast, in that it not only shows the functional availability of a platform like Mentimeter or Ahaslides, but more so it takes you into a journey of how you might use this, how it might compare against Aegis or SAMR, and how you'd use it to bring deeper value to the learning in the classroom. The whole point behind educational technology is to deepen the experience, to deepen the meaning making of that experience, and to make the learning stickier through the agency of that particular technology. So I haven't been as comprehensive as I might be, but I'm aware of the time that might take, and I'm really seeking to create watershed moments for you of how this might work in your classroom. If you have been using either of these platforms or an alternative, please give me a use case example. I'd love you to send me a short video or add something to the comments about how you, in fact, are using one of these apps to deepen the learning and how it might map against SAMR and indeed Aegis. So a quick wrap up then on the comparison between these two platforms. They are very, very similar, and there are some key differences between them. These differences may be small and insignificant to you, or they might be a sort of deal breaking. And in some cases, they have been deal breaking for me. So let's take a look at the pricing structures, and that's the first point of comparison. Now this is behind me the Ahaslides pricing structure. And one of the things that you can see straight away is that there's a free version. Now for most teachers, the free version works really well in Ahaslides. It's a really big plus for Ahaslides in comparison with Mentimeter. And here's the thing, Ahaslides do not limit the number of slides you can make with the free version, but they do limit the number of users that can concurrently add their data. 7 users at any one time can be adding data to the slide set. Now, your learning design, particularly in the way that you engage individuals or groups with the data collection phase, will determine if this is a breaking point or not. I could imagine situations in workshops or in classrooms where people are broken into groups and they get a chance to answer those questions in phases through the session. For me, in a session with a group of adult learners, maybe say 15 to 24 or so is typically the number that I work with, then I would find that a bit constraining, and I would probably go up to the next level simply to increase the number of co-participants that can answer the questions concurrently at the same time. A missing piece for me in Ahaslides is the ability to embed, using embed code, to place the results into some other platform. I use courseware often, a course platform, to deliver my learning programs, and I'm using that same platform to deliver this podcast in an enhanced version. And I'll be placing in the show notes an example of Mentimeter and how you can embed that into things that use HTML. So this is a really useful feature for me, but if you're not into embedding, then that may not be a big deal breaker. A quick look at Mentimeter's pricing structure. Again, you can see there's a free version, but we jump to the next paid version being double, and then the pro version, which I use, being quite a bit more expensive again. That embed feature aside, the limitation at the free end probably will impact on you, and that's the number of slides you can use. So you can have any number of concurrent users, but what you'll get is only 2 slides, a third if you promote the platform to someone else using social media. So potentially 2 to 3 free slides. Now, in some cases, that won't be too much of a limitation. In many of the slide sessions that I build, I use around 4 to 5, depending on the learning design and the purpose for that data collection. So I've opted for something in my professional training regime to provide a pro version of it. But I'm seriously considering switching after a number of years to Ahaslides. Ahaslides also allows you to create a custom code for your polls, whereas Mentimeter gives you a set of letters and numbers. It's a little bit more restricting in that sense. Both provide QR codes and a range of ways for the poll collection to occur, but I find Mentimeter's presentation a little bit more flexible, as I said before, with the embed code in particular. So I had one small surprise up my sleeve for you, and while this has been a comparison of 2 strong platforms, Ahaslides and Mentimeter, there's a third that's lurking around that I think you need to know about, and that's ClassPoint. Now, if you are a user of Windows and Microsoft PowerPoint, then this may well be the thing for you. Now, this is a very powerful integration of many of the features we've been talking about today into the PowerPoint environment. So again, it's a slide-based engagement, and yes, there are a whole range of different styles of data collection and live polling, either remotely or for live classes in real life, and this provides a wonderful opportunity if you are already using PowerPoint and Windows machines. You can see here by the slide in the background that you can create quizzes and polls directly in the PowerPoint app itself, and this provides wonderful opportunities for teachers to engage in this sort of technology without a steep learning curve. At the moment, as I've said, this is only for Windows and PowerPoint users. You can see again from their pricing structure that they've got a number of slides, 5 slides free, which I think is very generous, and a class. And this gives you ample opportunity to check this out and work with it. Their pro price is very reasonable. And again, having met with these guys and knowing their aspirations and goals for improving education, this is definitely something that's worth looking at if you have the right equipment and software. So it seems like I've been talking for such a long time now. I hope this has given you a bit of an insight into powerful platforms that can deepen engagement, deepen reflection, deepen analysis, and provide insight and surprise, particularly with data that's owned by a particular audience or set of people. I think the opportunities are broad and deep, and I can see situations where students doing research projects can start to poll wide audiences and gather big data sets to provide deep insight into learning around a particular topic, context, or subject. I'd love to know what you see. I'd love to know what you do already, and I'd love you to suggest also other apps that I might be looking at. So I'm hoping that today's discovery, exploration, discussion has added something to your world. I hope that it has helped you in some way start to see how you can enhance and even transform the difference that you want to bring to the people that you influence in your teaching. So grow well and see you in the next podcast. Take care.